The lawyer's office was silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock, and Daniel sat with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the man across the desk like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all an elaborate prank. Beside him, his wife Sophia sat with perfect posture, her handbag resting neatly on her knees, her face calm in a way that made the silence even more unbearable. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read the line on the paper one more time, just to be sure he wasn't misreading it. He had handled thousands of divorce cases in his career. Cheating, money, distance, boredom. But never this. He looked up slowly, removed his glasses, and asked, almost in disbelief, "Mrs. Sophia, are you absolutely certain this is your reason?" Sophia didn't blink. She simply said, "Yes." The lawyer looked at Daniel, then back down at the paper, and read it aloud in a voice that cracked slightly with disbelief. "Reason for divorce. My husband is simply too ugly." The room went completely still. Daniel actually laughed, a short, nervous laugh. The kind people make when they're sure a joke is coming. It never came. 3 weeks later, the divorce was finalized. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, twisted and exaggerated with every retelling, until even people who had never met Daniel were laughing about the man whose own wife couldn't stand looking at him. Strangers in the grocery store, co-workers who barely knew his name, people online who turned his pain into a meme. But exactly 2 years later, in a quiet supermarket on an ordinary afternoon, Sophia reached for the newest issue of Vogue sitting on the magazine rack. She glanced at the cover the way anyone glances at a magazine, out of habit more than interest. Then her eyes actually focused on the face staring back at her, and the magazine slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft slap. Because the man smiling confidently on the cover of the world's biggest fashion magazine was the exact same man she had once called too ugly to be seen with. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How does a man everyone laughed at end up on the cover of Vogue? Was Daniel really as unattractive as Sophia made him out to be, or was something else going on entirely? Why did Sophia become so obsessed with appearances in the first place? What was it about Daniel that made people treat him like a walking punchline for years? And what happened to him in the silence after the divorce, when nobody was watching? Who found him? Was it luck, timing, or something he had been building inside himself the entire time he was being mocked? And when Sophia finally saw him again, face to face, what would he say to her? Would he want revenge, closure, or something far bigger than either? The answer to all of it wasn't hidden in Daniel's face. It was hidden in the people who had spent years looking at him and never actually seeing him. To understand how Daniel ended up there, you have to go back to who he was before any of this happened, because Daniel was, by every account, one of the kindest men anyone had ever met. He held doors open for strangers. He remembered the names of every cashier at the corner store. He helped his elderly neighbor carry her groceries up 3 flights of stairs every single week without being asked. He worked long hours as an accountant at a mid-sized firm, the kind of job nobody glamorizes but everyone depends on, and he never complained about it. He smiled constantly, sometimes at the wrong moments, which only made him more endearing to the people who actually paid attention. Unfortunately, Daniel also seemed to be cursed with the kind of luck that turned ordinary life into a string of small humiliations. In every family photo, without fail, Daniel was the one blinking. Every single time. His passport photo looked so unfortunate that the officer at the counter actually laughed out loud before catching himself and apologizing. Automatic doors at the mall seemed to have a personal vendetta against him, refusing to open until he was practically standing on top of the sensor while everyone behind him waited impatiently. Small children would look up at him in grocery store lines and ask, with total innocence, "Mister, are you tired?" Dogs would stare at him from across the street with deep suspicion, as if he'd done something to offend their ancestors. His barber, despite Daniel's clear and repeated instructions, gave him the wrong haircut almost every single visit, And Daniel, being Daniel, would simply pay, thank the man, and walk out looking like a confused scarecrow. Whenever he waved at someone across a parking lot, at least half the time the person would look behind them, assuming Daniel was waving at someone else, and Daniel would slowly lower his hand and pretend he'd just been stretching. Even mirrors, he used to joke, seemed to dislike him on certain mornings. Through all of it, Daniel laughed. He laughed at himself before anyone else could. It was disarming, and it was the very thing that made people who actually got to know him fall in love with his personality almost instantly. The problem was that Sophia never seemed to fall in love with anything except how things looked. Sophia was, without question, beautiful in the conventional sense. The kind of beautiful that turned heads in restaurants and got free upgrades at hotel counters. She was stylish, always color-coordinated, always camera-ready, and supremely confident in any room she walked into. She had grown up believing, deeply and unshakably, that appearance was the currency of success, that how you looked determined how far you'd go, who would take you seriously, and who would love you. She measured people, often without realizing she was doing it, by how attractive they appeared at first glance. She would compare Daniel, sometimes out loud and sometimes in cutting little comments, to actors and celebrities, asking him things like, "Why can't you stand the way he stands?" Or, "Did you see how good his jawline looked in that picture? Imagine if you had that." At first, Daniel genuinely believed she was joking. He'd laugh along, thinking it was just Sophia being Sophia, sharp-tongued but harmless. But slowly, the jokes stopped sounding like jokes. They started sounding like verdicts. She began editing him out of photographs before posting them. Not out of malice exactly, but out of what she told herself was just aesthetic preference. A beautiful sunset over the ocean, the two of them standing together, and by the time it hit her social media, it was just her, alone, captioned, "Beautiful day." Daniel noticed. He never said anything the first few times. Then it became a pattern he couldn't ignore. At dinner parties, she'd ask him, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Could you maybe not smile so big in front of everyone tonight?" At a beach trip with her cousins, she handed him oversized sunglasses and said, "Just wear these, it helps." Indoors. At night. In group photos, she'd gently nudge him to stand in the back row, behind taller, more photogenic relatives, saying it was just better composition. When new people came over and asked who he was, more than once she introduced him as "my cousin," before catching herself and laughing it off as a slip of the tongue. She wouldn't hold his hand in public the way she used to in the early days of their relationship. At one dinner party, a guest complimented a photo on the wall and asked who the man in it was, and Sophia, without missing a beat, said, "Oh, the lighting in that one makes him look worse than he actually is." And everyone laughed, including Daniel, because what else was he supposed to do in that moment? Laugh along or fall apart in front of strangers? He chose to laugh. Every single time, he chose to laugh in public and cry quietly later, alone in the bathroom with the faucet running so she wouldn't hear him through the door. He still believed, with the kind of stubborn hope that only truly kind people seem to carry, that love could fix this, that if he was patient enough, gentle enough, good enough, Sophia would eventually see him the way he saw her. He had no idea that his biggest humiliation was still coming, and that it would happen in front of the entire neighborhood. It happened on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening. Sophia came home, sat Daniel down at the kitchen table, and told him, in the same calm tone she might use to discuss what to order for dinner, that she wanted a divorce. When he asked why, genuinely confused, genuinely hoping there was some misunderstanding he could fix, she looked him directly in the eyes and said the words that would follow him for years. "I can't keep being married to an ugly man, Daniel. I just can't. I've tried." He sat there for a long moment, waiting for her to laugh, to say it was a test, to say anything that would make this not real. She didn't. Word got out fast, the way it always does in small, gossip-hungry circles. Friends who had smiled in his face for years quietly admitted to each other that they'd always kind of agreed with Sophia. Neighbors whispered about it over fences. Even some of Daniel's own relatives, people who had eaten at his table, laughed at the story when they thought he wasn't in earshot. The divorce, which should have been one of the most painful private moments of his life, became neighborhood entertainment. A story people repeated at parties because it was just so unbelievable. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't beg. He didn't fight for a marriage that had already decided he wasn't worth fighting for. He simply signed the papers, packed one small suitcase, and walked out of the house they had shared, leaving behind the furniture, the photos that didn't have him in them anyway, and the version of himself that had spent years trying to earn love through patience alone. To everyone watching, it looked like the end of Daniel's story. It looked like a broken man disappearing in shame. It wasn't the end at all. It was, in the truest sense, only the beginning. If this story has made you laugh, cry, or shake your head in disbelief, comment, "I'm still watching." I'd love to know who's still on this emotional journey with Daniel. After the divorce, Daniel essentially vanished from the lives of everyone who had known him as half of a couple. He stopped going to the gatherings where people whispered about him. He stopped checking the social media accounts where Sophia's friends had quietly liked and shared jokes at his expense. People assumed he was hiding, ashamed, licking his wounds in some dark apartment somewhere. And honestly, for the first few weeks, that wasn't entirely wrong. He moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town, the kind with a leaky kitchen faucet and a view of a brick wall. And for a while, he simply existed there, replaying Sophia's words over and over in his head like a song stuck on repeat. But somewhere in the middle of that quiet, painful stretch of time, something shifted in him. He wasn't trying to become handsome. He understood, somewhere deep down, that chasing a version of beauty that would satisfy people who had already decided he wasn't enough was a losing game. Instead, he started trying to become something else entirely. Confident, whole, unbothered by the noise. He started taking long walks in the evenings just to clear his head. He picked up an old hobby he'd abandoned years earlier, sketching, and found himself filling notebook after notebook with little drawings of strangers he saw on the street. People with interesting faces, faces with character, faces that told stories instead of just looking pretty. He started talking to people again, not to impress them, but because he genuinely enjoyed connecting with them. Slowly, the weight he had been carrying for years began to feel just slightly lighter. It was during one of these ordinary evenings, while he was sitting outside a small coffee shop sketching an elderly man feeding pigeons across the street, that a stranger approached him and asked if she could sit down. She introduced herself as a fashion photographer, one of the more respected names in the industry, though Daniel had no idea who she was at the time. She told him, with total directness, that she'd been watching him for the past 10 minutes, not because he was conventionally handsome, but because his face had something she almost never saw anymore, in an industry obsessed with symmetry and perfection. She called it authenticity. She said every wrinkle on his face told a story, every awkward angle felt human, every imperfect smile felt real in a way that polished, filtered faces simply didn't. Daniel actually laughed out loud, assuming she was either joking or selling something. She wasn't. She handed him her card and told him to call her if he was ever curious, and then she walked away, leaving Daniel sitting there, utterly bewildered, staring down at a business card that would eventually change the entire trajectory of his life. What followed was, frankly, one of the most chaotic and hilarious stretches of Daniel's life. He showed up to his first photo shoot nervous, stiff, and completely out of his element, surrounded by people half his age who seemed to know instinctively how to angle their chins and where to put their hands. A model coach took one look at him and said, "Okay, give me mysterious." And Daniel, who had never once in his life tried to look mysterious, simply stood there looking deeply confused, squinting slightly into the lights. The photographer loved it instantly, calling it raw vulnerability. The coach tried again. "Don't smile this time," she instructed, and right on cue, Daniel sneezed violently. Mid-shot, his eyes scrunched and his whole face contorted, and somehow, against all logic, it turned out to be one of the most striking photos of the entire session. "Walk naturally toward the camera," they told him next, and Daniel, walking naturally, tripped over a lighting cable and stumbled forward in a way that looked, to everyone watching through the lens, like an intentional, edgy strut. The room actually applauded. They thought it was art. Daniel, mortified, just stood there rubbing his knee. In interviews, when asked which designers he loved wearing, Daniel, who genuinely had no idea about luxury fashion, referred to a pair of extremely expensive designer loafers as his office slippers, and the fashion executives in the room laughed so hard one of them had to leave to compose herself. Instead of being embarrassed by these moments, the industry around him began to celebrate them. His complete and total honesty, his refusal to pretend he understood a world he was new to, became his signature. People found it refreshing in a way nobody could have predicted. But underneath the laughter and the slowly building momentum, Daniel was still fighting an internal battle that nobody on set could see. Late at night, alone in his apartment, Sophia's voice would creep back into his head uninvited. "I can't keep being married to an ugly man." He would stare at himself in the mirror after a long day of shoots and wonder if any of this was real, or if it was some strange, temporary fluke that would evaporate the moment people realized their mistake. He came dangerously close to quitting more than once, convincing himself he didn't belong, that someone would eventually pull back the curtain and expose him as a joke being played on an entire industry. It was the photographer and a few of the mentors he met along the way who refused to let him walk away. They reminded him, again and again, that what made him compelling wasn't a face that fit some old, narrow definition of beauty. It was the way he carried himself, the warmth in his eyes, the honesty in every gesture, the fact that he had survived being told he wasn't enough and chosen to keep showing up anyway. Slowly, painfully, that belief started to take root inside him too. His posture changed, his eye contact changed, the way he spoke about himself changed, and somewhere in that transformation, without him fully realizing it, his very first Vogue cover was being scheduled. Daniel had absolutely no idea that someone from his old life was about to flip through a magazine and see his face staring back at her, while Daniel's life was quietly rebuilding itself into something extraordinary. Sophia's life had taken a very different turn. Not long after the divorce, she had remarried, quickly and somewhat impulsively, a man who seemed, on the surface, like everything she had once said she wanted. He was undeniably handsome, the kind of handsome that photographed well from every angle, the kind of handsome he was deeply, painfully aware of himself. He was also a social media influencer who spent more time admiring his own reflection than he ever spent looking at her. He used her expensive skincare products without asking, copied her entire beauty and wellness routine, repackaged it as his own content, and built a growing following off habits he'd quietly stolen from the very woman he claimed to love. Sophia watched slowly and with growing dread as he became more obsessed with his online image than with their actual relationship, filming content in their kitchen, their bedroom, even during what should have been private, intimate moments. Eventually, predictably, he left her for someone with an even larger following, someone who could boost his numbers and his brand deals. Sophia was devastated, humiliated in a way that felt almost cruelly poetic given everything she had once put Daniel through, though she wasn't ready to make that connection just yet. Needing stability, she took a job at a fashion magazine, doing administrative and editorial support work, a far cry from the glamorous lifestyle she'd once imagined for herself. One ordinary morning, her boss handed her the newest issue of Vogue and asked her to review it for an internal meeting, casually, the way you'd ask a colleague to grab coffee. Sophia sat down at her desk, opened the magazine without much thought, and began flipping through the pages. And then she stopped. Completely, utterly stopped. There he was, Daniel, on the cover. Confident, elegant, his eyes carrying a warmth and a calm she had genuinely never seen on his face before. Not once in all their years together. It wasn't that his features had transformed into something unrecognizable. It was something deeper than that, something she couldn't quite put into words in that moment. His spirit had changed. The magazine slipped from her hands and hit the floor of the office with a sharp slap, drawing the attention of two co-workers nearby. She sat frozen, staring down at it, her face pale. "That's my ex-husband," she whispered, almost to herself. Nobody around her believed it. One co-worker actually laughed, assuming it was some kind of joke. It wasn't until her boss showed her the press release explaining why Vogue had chosen Daniel for the cover that the full weight of it hit her. Readers had voted him the most authentic new face in fashion after a candid behind-the-scenes campaign of his went unexpectedly viral. A campaign that wasn't about polished perfection at all, but about confidence, kindness, and the courage to be unapologetically yourself in an industry obsessed with looking flawless. His story, the quiet humiliation, the disappearance, the rebuilding, had somehow reached and inspired millions of people, many of whom had no idea it was happening in real time while it unfolded. Sitting there at her desk, surrounded by the very industry she once believed only rewarded people who looked a certain way, Sophia finally understood something she had spent years refusing to see. She had never been married to an ugly man. She had thrown away an extraordinary one. If you're still watching up to now, type, "I'm still here," in the comments section. Weeks later, Sophia learned that Daniel was scheduled to attend one of the biggest fashion events of the year, a glittering, high-profile gala celebrating the magazine's latest issue, the very one with his face on the cover. She told herself she just wanted to see him, to apologize quietly, to maybe explain herself in some way that would make her feel less haunted by what she'd done. She put on her best dress, the kind of outfit she used to wear specifically to be seen, and made her way to the venue, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. When she reached the entrance, security stopped her immediately, asking for an invitation she didn't have. Flustered, desperate, she blurted out, "I'm his wife. I'm Daniel's wife." The words hung in the air, awkward and untrue, and the security guards exchanged a skeptical glance, clearly preparing to escort her away. But somehow, in the noise and chaos of the entrance, Daniel heard her voice. He turned, saw her standing there, and after a long pause, he walked toward the entrance himself. Calm, composed, dressed impeccably. Nothing at all like the nervous, blinking man from the family photos she used to edit out of every post. The security guard stepped back instinctively, sensing the moment had shifted into something much bigger than a guest list dispute. Sophia opened her mouth to explain herself, but Daniel spoke first, his voice gentle but unmistakably firm. "No," he said, looking directly at her. "You're my ex-wife." The single word hit the small crowd that had gathered like a physical blow. Silence spread outward in waves. A few reporters nearby, sensing a story, began quietly gathering closer, phones lifting, cameras turning. Sophia's eyes filled with tears almost instantly, and right there, in front of strangers, photographers, and people who had once mocked Daniel from a distance, she apologized, her voice cracking, asking if there was any chance, any small chance at all, that he might consider giving them another try. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with the bitterness anyone watching might have expected after everything she'd put him through. He looked at her with something closer to sadness, the kind reserved for someone you once loved deeply, who never managed to see you clearly. "If you had stayed," he said quietly, "I'd still believe I wasn't enough." He thanked her sincerely for the lesson her leaving had ultimately taught him, even if it hadn't felt like a gift at the time. Then he turned and walked back into the event, leaving her standing at the entrance as reporters' cameras flashed around her, capturing the exact moment her own public humiliation, the mirror image of what she had once put him through, began. Inside the venue, when word of what had happened spread through the crowd, the room erupted into applause, not out of cruelty toward Sophia, but out of genuine admiration for the calm, dignified way Daniel had handled a moment that could so easily have turned bitter. There was no shouting, no insults, no public takedown, just quiet, undeniable truth, spoken once and left to stand on its own. In the months that followed, Daniel's career continued to rise, but those who worked closely with him noticed something that mattered far more than his growing fame. He never let it change who he fundamentally was. He still remembered the names of the assistants on set. He still helped carry equipment when nobody asked him to. He started using his growing platform to speak openly to young people, and honestly, to people of every age, about the years he'd spent believing he wasn't enough simply because someone he loved had decided his worth based on appearance alone. In interviews, he would often pause, get quiet for a moment, and say something close to this: "The mirror never decides your value. People's opinions don't either. Character outlives beauty, every single time, even when it doesn't feel that way in the moment you're living through it." Audiences responded to those words in a way that surprised even him, flooding his comment sections and inboxes with their own stories of being overlooked, mocked, or made to feel small because of how they looked, and thanking him for showing them that it was possible to rebuild from that kind of wound into something whole and strong. As for Sophia, she quietly stepped back from public life after that night at the gala. She wasn't publicly destroyed or humiliated in any dramatic, vengeful way, because Daniel never gave anyone that satisfaction, and frankly, he never wanted to. Her downfall, if you could even call it that, wasn't something Daniel inflicted on her. It was simply the slow, painful consequence of choices she had made years earlier. Choices rooted in a belief system that had told her appearance was everything, right up until the moment it cost her the one person who had loved her without conditions. She wasn't defeated by Daniel's success. She was defeated by the years she had spent measuring people by the wrong scale entirely. Some people spend their whole lives searching for a beautiful face, certain that it's the thing that will finally make them happy, finally make their life complete, only to realize, often far too late, that they walked straight past, or worse, walked away from, a truly beautiful soul. Daniel's story spread not because he became famous, but because of what his journey represented to so many people watching it unfold from the outside. That being underestimated, mocked, even abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes it's the very beginning of becoming who you were always meant to be. Daniel never set out for revenge. He never needed it. He simply kept showing up, kept being kind, kept choosing confidence over bitterness, and in the end, that quiet persistence became the loudest statement of all. So here's what Daniel's story really teaches us. The people who try to make you feel small, who measure your worth by things as fleeting as appearance, are often revealing far more about their own insecurities than they are about your actual value. Real character, real kindness, real resilience. These are the things that don't fade with time or trends, and they are the things that ultimately shine the brightest when everything else fails. Daniel didn't change his face to win. He changed how he saw himself, and that made all the difference in the world. Thank you so much for staying with us through Daniel's entire journey today. From that painful courtroom moment to the powerful, dignified way he finally faced his past. We genuinely hope this story reminded you that your worth was never up for someone else's vote. Tell us in the comments what part of Daniel's story you enjoyed the most, and if this video moved you, made you laugh, or reminded you of your own strength, please make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next unforgettable story, just like this one.